Many years ago, actually in a church, after a rehearsal of the choir one evening, I fell into conversation with a colleague of mine, a guy named Bill Roberts, who was an old friend and who was the minister of the church that I was attending at the time. And we were in a choir rehearsal, and we were rehearsing something by Mozart. And we were both marveling at how Mozart's genius seemed as if he was somehow wired to something divine. It seems miraculous how his compositions became standard, essential parts of our vocabulary as cultured people. And Bill Roberts and I were talking about this matter, and the phrase, "the arbitrary becomes essential," somehow got invented in that conversation. And I'm not sure it was I who uttered it first or Bill who uttered it first. One of us said it, the other ratified it. And so that's a nifty thing to think about.
What do you mean by the arbitrary becomes essential?
First of all, focus on the two really, well, three words really.
Right.
One is arbitrary. The throw of the dice, and a lot of what happens in the world is a result of, in some sense, randomness. And then becomes is a sense of motion. That which is random becomes something that is no longer random but fixed, as when you make up a poem or you make up a piece of music or when you make up something to speak and then gets remembered. Essential means that it's something that has lasting significance, not just something that is ephemeral, something that comes and goes, but something that is worth referring to again and again, something that has substance, depth, longevity, purpose. And it's particularly apt that I choose that title to use as a way of addressing the International Society for Dialogical Science, because when I thought about it, that phrase becomes applicable to all sorts of things in psychology and out of it that seemed to me to be instructive and enlightening, so I wanted to enlarge upon the significance of that phrase. And it's, as I say, particularly appropriate to do it in this context because the phrase came into existence in a dialogue. I didn't invent it out of my head, nor Bill out of his head, but it somehow came into existence as the two of us were talking. And what you discover is that things that are discovered in a conversation get ratified and then sort of roll out on their own as some sort of essential truth. When I was invited to give this talk, I thought of organizing it into three sections. One having to do with my origins as a person, really, as a human being with a body and with a profession and a career, with a family. And the second having to do with my family, and they're an important part of my life as well. And the third part has to do with, in some sense, my career as a psychologist. I think I showed to you before a little card that I prepared that has on the one side this phrase, "You are a miracle." And on the other side, it has a phrase that is probability of Y, probability of U, is equal to 1 over 2 to the 46th power. 2 to the 46th power ends up being 70 trillion possible mutations of the genetic material that comprises all of us, okay? So if you do the mathematics, you figure that there are 1 in 70 trillion, whatever it is, outcomes that may result from a particular pairing of the genetic material from your mother and your father. My own mother and my own father. They're real people. They had me in real time back in 1937. The whole story begins with that particular event. And I want to say, if being miraculous has something to do with being unlikely, then I think we all have a claim to being miraculous in that sense. The process of development, you have no control about how you're going to be named or how you're going to be handled. The custom was, when I was a young child, for parents to sort of play around with the gender of their offspring. And so one of the photographs which my parents took when I was something like 3 or 4 years old is a photograph of me as a little girl. That photograph illustrates the possibility that, you're not just a person who has an essence that's realized over time, but you're exposed to a variety of influences which may change or modify, in this case temporarily, what gender space you're occupying, okay? It's at least instructive to notice that process of becoming a boy or a man and all the rest is not just a question of biology. It's also a question of how you're regarded and how and with the claims that are made about you being one gender or another over time. My own birth is an example of the arbitrary becoming essential, because all that genetic material ain't nothing until it is born into a child. When I was a student at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, I came to Trinity College on a scholarship, which was itself came about because the guidance counselor at my high school in Southern Illinois received a brochure from Trinity College, which I'd never heard of. So I applied to Trinity, was accepted, and was awarded a full ride scholarship for the entire four-year program. In my senior year at Trinity, I was on my way out to Berkeley, California, where I'd been accepted as a graduate student in the psychology department. Met a fellow, a fraternity brother of mine, who at Trinity College, who said, well, listen, if you're going out to San Francisco, my sister, who just graduated from Smith College, is living in San Francisco. Here's her phone number. Why don't you ring her up when you get there? She has some friends that you'd like to meet, and so it gets you started meeting somebody in the Bay Area. Had a telephone. I called Wendy Mixter, who was living in San Francisco at the time, and we made made a date to meet in the East Bay terminal. Again, a series of accidents leading to other accidents and leading to this meeting between me and Wendy. And we just had the easiest time talking. We talked the entire evening away, and at the end of the evening, we made a commitment to see each other again. I asked her if she'd like to see me again. She said yes. I said, well, I'd certainly like to see you again. We were engaged after a year. We moved to Connecticut in 1963. As soon as we came to Wesleyan, shortly thereafter, we began to think about family, and so we had two sons, one born in 1964 and one born in 1967. And we were, I say blissfully lucky in the genetic hand that both of those kids ended up exhibiting. They were both healthy and both presentable human beings and have gone on to distinguished careers. In the year 2011, we decided to go to Hawaii. Myself, my two sons, their wives, and their families, their children. And so all 13 of us went out to the island of Kauai in Hawaii and celebrated our 50th anniversary. And there's a photograph somewhere of at least the six of us, three couples, who made up the father and mother and the two sons and their wives. If you compound the probabilities, you see everything is infinitesimally unlikely to happen. Happening when and where it happens is another story altogether. But the miraculous thing is that somehow when things happen, they have happened. And you can actually make records of them, and you can regard them as real. And they are real, but they are also a product of myriad, proliferating, impossible things that occurred up to that point.
That's the becomes, right? What
That's
you're
the
talking
becoming,
about. You're
yes.
taking a picture,
yes,
socializing,
exactly.
conversing.
Yes.
These are the becomes of
That's right.
the arbitrary becomes essential.
Yes, exactly. But again, of all the people in the world, I never would have met Wendy if I hadn't gone to Berkeley. I never would have gone to Berkeley if I hadn't known her brother first at Trinity College. And as it was, I was accepted at the University of California at Berkeley and decided to go there. But I was also not accepted at Harvard University, where I had also applied and was rejected for reasons which became clear to me and for which I later became grateful for. Okay, the arbitrary becomes essential. So I was grateful for having been rejected at Harvard, but if I had been accepted, I probably would have made the mistake of going there. And in retrospect, it would have been a terrible mistake because I would have missed my wife and missed my mentor. Another arbitrary thing that became essential is I became a psychologist. I didn't start off in life intended to be a psychologist. Nobody expected me to be a psychologist, but it happened. It grew out of the set of circumstances into which I found myself placed. And it turned out that my older brother, Paul, had become a psychology student at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. And he impressed me with how much he liked psychology. So when I went to Trinity, I said, well, why don't I try psychology as a field? And so in my freshman year, a teacher of mine in social psychology said, "You know what, Scheibe, I think you have the makings of a psychologist." And again, it's a case of that which is arbitrary becoming essential. He didn't have to make that comment. I didn't have to pay any attention to it, but somehow it ratified for me a budding career possibility. Well, I could apply to become a graduate student in psychology and go on to become a psychologist. And then, so I got formed as a psychologist, again, by a series of accidents. And when I went to Berkeley, in my first class at Berkeley, there was a pro seminar for all new graduate students. And one of the teachers, the most prominent teachers in the pro seminar, was a man Ted Sarvin is his name. To make a long story short, he became my mentor, was my dissertation advisor. I did my dissertation with him. So my formation as a psychologist was largely due to Ted Sarvin's influence. And he incidentally used to be known as Mr. Role Theory, because he's the guy who wrote the chapter on role theory in the Handbook of Social Psychology, which I had read at Trinity College. Again, accidents. But because of that accident, I became his student. Because of that becoming his student, I became identified with this rather undeveloped facet of social psychology called psychology of dramaturgical psychology or narrative psychology. Then once I came to Wesleyan, I continued on for my entire academic career, and along the way invited Ted Sarvin, my mentor, to come and spend a year as a visiting fellow at Wesleyan. Many of my colleagues at Wesleyan became lifelong friends, and so our family we lived adjacent to the Wesleyan community. So all of those are developments that came out of the accidents of having the juxtaposition between Karl Scheibe and Wesleyan University. But there's another facet of my professional career which I own as an extraordinarily important part of my identity now, that has nothing to do with the fact that I'm a social psychologist or interested in the psychology of theater and all the rest. But it has to do with an opportunity that arose as a result of my pending retirement. As the year approached, an opportunity arose for me to participate in the development of a retirement center for retired faculty members. Bill Walsh, who had been the director of alumni relations at Wesleyan, wanted to give a substantial cash gift to Wesleyan. He and his wife had a fair amount of money. And he and I were playing squash rackets one evening with a bunch of other guys. We wandered to his house and we had beer and pizza together after the squash match. And I mentioned to him the possibility of a retirement center at Wesleyan that I had been thinking about. And he and his wife said, we're prepared to give an endowment gift of $1 million to Wesleyan to found a retirement center for retired faculty members. Would you be interested in helping us develop this proposal? And so, accidents, right? I grasped the opportunity immediately, formulated a 5-page proposal, which I immediately sent to President Bennett at the time. Got a meeting with him, and within a few weeks, we had chartered the Walsh Center for Retired Faculty Members at Wesleyan. Now that may not last forever. Who knows? Essences can disappear into the mist, but it exists now, and it has nurtured the lives of already many scores of retired faculty members who have been able to extend their careers in teaching and research as a result of these efforts. You know, I think every day we should just rise and rejoice in the possibility of life itself, but also in the poetic possibilities that are realized without our awareness or direct participation by just the continual repetition of random events. I don't consider myself to be a poet, although poetry is one of the great things to which to aspire as a human being, because finding the right words, finding the right images, finding the right mood, the right atmosphere. You know, when we get up and put on clothes and go about dressing ourselves for the day, it's somewhat of a poetic act. A composition that is meant to interact with other compositions, other people we're going to be meeting during the course of the day, to form something that might in fact be memorable and worthwhile.
Off of that, the last thing, if you wouldn't mind just speaking on this, the arbitrary becoming essential requires both the individual and the community.
That's right. That's correct. Because we are, it's not just the community, incidentally. The moment, I think of this in relation to, I remember one time I had a date with a girl from Mount Holyoke, and it was a moonlit night, and we were walking along in the Holyoke campus after having been out at Rahar's or someplace in Northampton, drinking and dancing, whatever. And I looked at her and she looked at me, and I said, now's the moment to kiss her. And then somehow I decided, no, I can't. I didn't feel quite the mood to do that. So we walked on, and a couple hundred yards later I turned to her and said, can I kiss you? And she said, you missed the moment. And indeed, that lesson stayed with me forever. That moment was ephemeral, you know, it came and it went, but I couldn't recover it. Every pathway has its forks, and if you take the wrong fork, you're unlikely to be able to recover the first thing again.